cannot be allowed to leave this place. He would ruin everything.
I'm willing to take full responsibility for the horrible events of the last 24 hours, but you must understand. Our interest in their world was purely for the betterment of mankind. Everything has clearly gotten out of hand now, yes. But it was worth the risk, I assure you.
Everybody. I tell you, I'm so happy to be speaking to you all this evening. This is absolutely brilliant. I'm really, really happy to be speaking to you all. One, because I know it's 5 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon, so I can guarantee that at least 30% of you are sober. The second thing is that I really have not had a chance to geek out on those wonderful details that went into the Good Doom soundtrack like I will tonight. So if you're here for those sort of geeky details, that's really what we're going to get into. Let's get started. Have you ever received a brief that went something like this? We want you to make music that no one has ever heard before. It needs to fit the game perfectly and be instantly loved by millions of fans. Now, if you're anything like me, when you get a brief like that, your initial reaction is to run into the bathroom, pour the cold tap on, crawl up into a little ball, and have a little cry. But what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is how you can execute a brief like this, and I'm going to discuss with you the lessons that I learned to enable you to do so. I first met the id Software team back in about mid-2014. They sent me a music design document that started like this. Doom is about demons on Mars, you have a shotgun, send them back to hell. Cool. The second part of the brief went like this. No guitars. We hate guitars. We do not want guitars in our game. Do not put guitars in. Underneath that big section was a little line that said, I love synths. Cool? I can work with that. The third part of this brief went like this. We want you to create music that nobody's ever heard before. It needs to fit the game perfectly and instantly loved by millions of fans. Now, Doom fans, they're not like Disney fans. If Doom fans don't like what you've done, they'll burn your house down. So let's say we take a brief like this, right, and we hand it to a piano player. Now, this piano player is going to channel in the demons, and they're going to channel in the hell, and they're going to channel in the Mars. But what you're going to end up with is a solo piano piece. It's inspired by the brief, sure, but it's not an execution of the brief. Now, say you gave this same brief to a dubstep producer. This dubstep producer is going to take all those awesome demon growling basses. They're going to take some awesome bell samples to get the hell thing in there, and they're going to mix in some brass samples to get in the Mars thing, right? But what you're going to end up with is a dubstep track. It's inspired by the brief, sure. It's got synths in there, but it's not an execution of the brief. Now, same again if you handed that exact same brief to a composer, and that composer's instant reaction is to open up their Cubase template that they've worked with for the last 10 projects, and they're going to use all their demon contact patches, and they're going to use all their hell contact patches, and they're going to use all of their Mars contact patches. You're going to end up with the same piece of music that person has written for the last 10 projects. It's inspired by the brief, sure, but it's not an execution of the brief. Now, why have these three failed? The reason that they're failing in this example is that they're going through the exact same process that they've always done every single time. And you cannot expect to end up with a different outcome without changing the process. Change the process, change the outcome. Now, this is obviously a lot easier said than done. We're very fearful of changing the process. If you're anything like me, you suffer terribly from the fear of rejection. It's that fear of rejection that disables us from changing our process. Why? Because that's asking you to take everything you know and put it aside. Come up with a new process in the hopes that you're going to reach something better. Now, as humans, we don't want to do that. If something has worked a certain way before, we want to repeat that process to end up with what we perceive is going to be the same result. If it's gotten us a success in the past, we expect it's going to get us a success in the future. But in the ever-changing perpetual world that we live in, that's simply not the case. Change the process, change the outcome. But the key to this is working with a team that shares this exact same philosophy. I was very excited to meet the Doom team. Ben picked me up from the hotel in Dallas and drove me all the way down to the id offices. The whole way he played this most incredible electronic music. It was great. It was all this weird sort of crazy like experimental stuff. There's no beat, there's no time signature, there's no nothing. It's just random sort of weirdness. But he listens to this stuff every morning to inspire him. When I entered the office, I met Chad Mossholder. Chad was just finishing up the masters on his latest experimental electronic music album, this one here. Richard Devine did a remix on it. It's really, really fantastic stuff. I was then introduced to Chris Height, the audio director. Now, Chris's room I couldn't even get into because it was full of synthesizers. There was synths everywhere, there was boxes of sounds everywhere. I couldn't move. Straight away after meeting Chris, I was told that there was a very, 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 very important audio-centric meeting. So we all rushed into a room. You see, Aphex Twin had just dropped a couple of new tracks and we all had to have a listen. It was clear that these guys lived creativity and they breathed creativity. In fact, every Wednesday evening after work, they had this fantastic concept called Weird Wednesday, where they'd all get into a studio together and just geek out for a while on any new plugins or any new pieces of equipment that they got, and they just jam. Now, they're not jam in the conventional sense. There's not a tempo. There's not a key signature that they're set into. They're not playing licks or anything. Chad over there on the far right is running his guitar through his laptop, and he's playing with all sorts of Bejeweled modules, making all sorts of cool sounds. Ben in the middle there at the background, he had a Eurorack system, and he was making all sorts of awesome, incredible sounds with these Make Noise modules that he just picked up. That's Chris there on the left, and he had his Ableton Live setup, and he was making all sorts of processing and sound design based on what the other two guys were doing. I had my little laptop set down up at the front here. And the guys would record this, and they'd just jam away, making all sorts of weird random sounds for 2 hours, and they'd record it for archival reasons. But that wasn't really the purpose. The purpose here was to break away from any creative inhibitions. It was to break away from anything that was stopping them from getting to their creativity. What they were doing was creating an environment where each of them felt comfortable in failure. So I was so inspired after hanging out with these guys for a couple of days, and I couldn't wait to get back to my studio, right? And I was like, okay, cool, I'm going to come up with some really, really incredible, creative doom music based on synths and stuff, right? So synths, right, dude? So we got synths and there's hell, right? And hell's down below. So, synths, we can put them down below like a sub, yeah? So let's start with like a sub part, right? Oh man, GDC speakers, are you kidding me? That's what that sounds like. Okay, it's really low sub part, right? But this is actually really good. See, the trouble with sub notes is when you're running them so low, as we demonstrated just then, you can't hear them. So instead, we want to take some high-frequency content. We want to add some high-frequency content to those subparts in order for the player to be able to hear them on their TV systems. Now, one of the ways that I like to do this is to take white noise. And I take this white noise, and I turn the white noise on, and I turn the white noise off at a rate that mirrors the frequency of the sub underneath. So what I'm essentially doing here is ring modulation, right? But it's ring modulation at the audio frequency. Now, the sub there that you couldn't even really hear was ringing at about 36.7 hertz. So 36.7 times per second, that's bouncing or trying to bounce. It wasn't really bouncing. So when you take like a white noise and you do that with the same sort of thing, you end up with this sound. All right? So when you combine those two together and you get the sub and the white noise, you can hear them together. You're probably not going to hear the full result on these speakers, though. There's the sub. Right. feel we're really testing the GDC speakers here. Now, if you take this combination, you feed it through a distortion processor, you get all sorts of really interesting harmonics. In the next video here, I'll run these two together through some distortion. You'll hear all sorts of interesting stuff start to happen. Now, I'll turn the white noise off halfway through, and you can hear what the distortion is doing to the sub alone. And you'll notice that the white noise is actually doing quite a lot. All right, so there's where we go. So I was like, oh man, this is brilliant, right? Here we go. This is going to be the doom sound. We're going to take sine waves, I'm going to take noise, I'm going to run them through some distortion. I'm an absolute genius. This is brilliant. So I send this off to Chris, right? And I tapped out a really big email justifying the whole thing. And I said, man, this is going to be awesome. Let this thing blow your mind. And then I sent it off. I hit send on the email, and I awaited Chris's reply. He replied with this. Now, you're only laughing there because you're suffering the same fear of rejection that I am, right? And there I am, I read that on my screen, and I'm like, oh no, I failed again, right? Time to go turn on the cold water in the shower and have a bit of a cry. But then underneath that, he had these lines. I feel you've taken the first step on a journey toward the perfect destination. Keep going, you're almost there. Now, instantly, I felt comfortable with failure. I wasn't worried about failing with this team. I was encouraged to be able to keep going. Chris understood what I was trying to do here, but rather than rejecting it outright and therefore rejecting me and my abilities, he was saying, keep going, you're on the right path. He was encouraging an environment where I felt comfortable in failure. Now, it was clear after this that I really wasn't doing the right thing, right? I knew in myself it wasn't correct. All I'd done is taken some sounds and ran them through distortion. I mean, that's not really amazing. I'm a guitar player and made a living out of doing that exact thing for about 10 years. But what I needed to do was change the process, right? Change the process, change the outcome. I'm a big fan of Doom 3. I really, really quite enjoyed Doom 3. I really love the darkness that they were able to get into it. I really love storytelling. I thought it was such an amazing technical achievement that they were able to pull off back in 2004. I found it really, really quite inspiring. It was an interesting project. Now, of course, the music that you're hearing there, Chris Vrenna had produced this track for Doom 3. Now, Chris is an incredible person. I've only spoken to Chris a couple of times, but his high level of music ability is only matched by his personality. He's a really, really wonderful person. And Chris, of course, played drums with Nine Inch Nails for many years and went on to play with Marilyn Manson and all that sort of stuff. Really, really great guy. But it was his experience with Nine Inch Nails that remembered something. I remembered that at one point, Nine Inch Nails toured with David Bowie. Now, David Bowie himself is obviously a really incredible musician, and this reminded me of an interesting story. Back in 1977, when Bowie was in Berlin recording Heroes, he was working with a fascinating engineer named Tony Visconti. Now, due to the technical limitations that these guys were working with, they'd pretty much run out with tracks on this tape machine that they were using. They had one track left for vocals. But to get the full emotional impact of this song across, they needed to have reverb that was scalable. So Tony, the engineer, came up with this really incredible technique. He set up David Bowie in the middle of the studio here, right at the front here. So David would be singing into that microphone. About 20 feet away from that would be a second microphone. Then at the end of the hall was a third microphone. Now, microphones 2 and 3 at the back there were behind a gate. Right? Everybody understands what a gate is, right? Open, closed gate, audio gate, right? Now, when David was singing at the start of the song, and it was kind of low tones, there wasn't much volume to his voice. So this first microphone was all it was picking up. Then when he'd open up a little bit, the second microphone, the gate would open and allow some of his voice through. That would create a bit of a natural ambience. Then when Bowie would really rip into it, the gate on the third microphone at the back would open up. And what I thought was really fascinating about this is that they designed a system that dynamically added reverb based on the input. So I thought, well, what if I designed a system that dynamically produced interesting and appropriate musical bits based on the input? To be inspired by this, I started getting this awesome concept art through for the project. I was really fascinated by these concepts of where they had these giant rock structures that were being held together with this evil force of energy, this hell energy. And the story in the game is that this evil corporation has found a way to mine this energy as a source of renewable energy, right? Sustainable energy source. But I kind of love this idea that everything from your mobile phone to the TV you watch, to the pacemaker that's keeping you alive, to the plane that you're flying, is all being powered by energy mined from hell. This kind of evil energy, right? I had this idea about this sort of force that was traveling through things and getting corrupted, this evil energy. So with that in mind, I set out to design the following system. Now, for the sake of this next bit, I want you to think of audio like water. It flows downhill. We start with a computer at the top. The computer is what generates the sound. In this case, it was a simple sine wave. We'll go into more of that in a little bit. That computer split that signal out into 4 different paths. These paths went into a chain. The first chain consisted of a whole bunch of pedals, 4 pedals as a result. Now, for this first test, I actually wrote these down for the real geeks in the audience, if you're curious. So the first pedal there was a Retro Mechanical Labs 432K distortion box, really, really great distortion box. The second pedal was a Metasonics KV100, really interesting tube distortion. The third pedal was a Geiger counter. It's like a bit crusher that you can kind of do some cool stuff with. The fourth pedal was a Dwarfcraft fuzz from the Dwarfcraft devices guys. They're really, really cool as well. That was the first chain. At the bottom of that was a splitter. We'll get back to that one in a second. The second chain went through a very similar setup. We had another 4 pedals. The first one was another Geiger counter, just for awesomeness. The second one was a Metasonics TX3. Google it or don't. The third was a Mutron biphase, an old phaser from like the late 60s, early 70s, really, really old phaser pedal. And because I really liked old phaser pedals, there was a second one of those. It was a Dodd 70s phaser as well. So really, really cool stuff. At the end of that was a compressor. We'll come back to that one in a second. The third chain consisted of a tape echo. I had this Watkins copycat old tape echo. They would actually record to a tape, and then the record head is back with the play head, so whatever you record plays up behind. And that's it's like proper echo, actual natural echo on a tape machine, right? Real stuff. The second distortion box that was under that, the pedal 1 that you see listed there on the third chain, that was just another distortion box. It was a Trogotronic valve distortion thing. It wasn't really there for the distortion aspect. It was there more for the compression aspect. After that, I had this old Akai reel-to-reel machine from the 70s. It's like a tiny little 1/4-inch thing. Great sound, really, really grimy. What I was doing here was feeding it with about 40 decibels more than it could handle, which was really, really cool, and then recording back off it at the same time. Following on to that, that went into a spring reverb tank with a wet and dry control, so I could kind of play around with that. That went into a compressor, which I'll talk about in a second. The final one we did a couple of different interesting things with. The signal was sent out to a little mini amp. You know those little crappy like Fender mini amp things that got like a tiny little speaker in them? Again, it was being fed with about 40 decibels too much of what it can handle. That was being mic'd with a little like a microphone with, so the speaker had a microphone in front of it, and a little bit of that signal was being sent through a splitter back into the amp itself. So we're creating a feedback loop there. But the feedback loop was only very, very small. It was so small that if a sound was actually coming through the amp, it would choke out the feedback. And when that sound started to disappear, the feedback would come back up in the mix. I have a little example of that running here. So we can hear whenever that distortion sort of stuff starts to die out, the feedback comes in, right? So the next thing is that every single one of those ran into a mixer, so I could start summing things back down. That ran into an EQ and a compressor. The EQ wasn't really doing much. It was adding about 4 or 5 decibels down really low, about 30 to 60 hertz. And then we were adding about the same up about sort of 8 to 10, basically creating a nice sort of smiley face EQ. Nothing really amazing there. That was running into a compressor. This compressor was absolutely friggin' pinned. I'm kidding, it was knocking off about 20 decibels, right? The reason I was hitting it that hard was so when the loud noises would start to go away, the compressor would begin to open up and bring up all the interesting noise that every single one of these pedals and bits of equipment was creating. I'll show you more of that in a second. That's very important. The compressor itself was set at about a 30 millisecond attack, so we got some really cool punchy stuff. And then I'd adjust the release based on the tempo of whatever I was sending through it. Again, I'll show you that more in a second. The ratio was about 12 or 20 to 1. Pretty drastic, pretty crazy. And that was running straight into the digital audio workstation there and recording stuff. So what I'm going to do next is attempt to, if we can get some volume on the computer here, I'm going to show you my first experiment running through this array. I'm going to show you a series of sub-sine wave tones. They're 4 F notes, followed by a little bit of a gap. Oh, man. It's not meant to be buzzing, that's that buzzing over there. A gap. Okay, so that's it. Now I know what you're thinking, it's really not amazing, right? I know, music of the year right here, woo! But when you run that through this array, all sorts of interesting stuff starts to happen. What I want you to listen out for is a couple of things. At the end of those 4 F notes, you'll hear another note creep in underneath. It's like an E, it's like just below the F. That's not being generated from me, that's not being generated from the computer, that's coming from some ground hum within the array. Additional to that, there's all sorts of interesting distortion layers that are coming in and out based on that splitter on the left-hand side there that was sending a signal to those compressors along the bottom. Sometimes, if I wanted to, that was essentially side-chaining the signal from those other chains. So based on whatever the input based on whatever the input was doing, it could dynamically change the mix of whatever each chain I had. The last thing I want you to hear out for is all sorts of interesting stuff that's going on with the sonics and things. You'll hear all sorts of harmonics. Anyway, here again is that same subwoofer tone run through this array several times. Now we're getting somewhere interesting. So the way I started thinking about this was that this was my instrument. I'm feeding it a very basic input, and all I'm changing from that input is amplitude and pitch of what I'm sending through. Everything I was sending through it was a sine wave. That's it. The reason I chose a sine wave is because a sine wave is our most pure representation of what sound can be. It's simply a wave that goes up and a wave that comes back down. Therefore, any interesting thing that was happening within this array was being imparted onto that sine wave in the purest form possible. I started to think about this as my doom instrument. Now, don't care too much about this sort of thing. These pedals would change, I'd swap stuff out and all that sort of thing, but the concept remained the same. I'm going to show you a couple more examples of what I ran through it next. Here's another little subpart I ran through. I hope you guys can hear it. That's it. Very, very interesting. Not really, kind of sucks. Here it is run through that array. All I'm doing is changing the amplitude and then tweaking some of the knobs as I go. Here's another example. This is the same sort of thing. So I'll just play that one again. So it's da-da-dun, 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 da-da-dun. Pretty basic, right? Now, I'm going to play that one through this array again. You'll hear the rhythm change halfway through just because I was getting bored with the same da-da-dun, da-da-dun, da-da-dun over and over again. Again, everything there is being generated based on those sine waves alone. So here, finally, we're finding something that's interesting. This is some interesting music that is appropriate to Doom. It starts feeling good. When we started putting it into the game, it started working really, really quite well. But we only reached this thing because I changed the process. Changed the process, and we changed the outcome. So here we are, finally we had something interesting, right? Some really stuff that was kind of unique, it was kind of special to Doom. It started feeling really, really good. Throwing it into the game, everybody was responding it to really well. We were really quite happy with it. The thing was though, it was missing something. See, the modern Doom is nothing but a tribute to 90s game design. 90s game design is really quite fascinating. You walk into a room and you're instantly presented with a series of very distinguishable enemies. It's your job then to figure out what weapon you want to pick to be able to kind of get rid of those enemies. Now, it's for that reason that you're allowed to carry as many weapons as you like. You don't need to aim down the sights. You're not hiding behind cover. None of this sort of stuff. The idea is that you're being constantly encouraged to move. It's very quick. It's very fast. In fact, even when you start to take health, you've got to go look for a health pack. You can't just hide somewhere and have it generate. It's all about kind of keeping that moving, right? Now, I feel that what was really interesting about the Doom team on the new Doom was that we're really able to capture that 90s feeling, even with a modern first-person shooter. When I visited the id Studios in Dallas, I was really blown away with how well the new Doom game actually felt. It was making me get these sort of weird nostalgic feelings of playing Doom back in the day. It was feeling very, very similar to the same thing. So the game itself there felt like Doom, but it wasn't sounding like Doom. And I knew exactly why. We had no guitars. Now, of course, there's a really good reason behind that, right? I mean, I know they said no guitars, we had guitars, don't put guitars into a game, but I totally understood why. Why? It's because the sound of an electric guitar somehow instantly summarizes a genre that has become a bit of a joke.
So I'll pick one up when I go out today. Other than that, I'm in good shape.
So, I mean, you can instantly see why. No developer wants to be associated with such a joke, right? I mean, it totally makes sense. The thing is, though, that harsh, aggressive, upfront sound that you get from a guitar is exactly appropriate, and it was the thing that was missing from the soundtrack. Now, it took some convincing, but after a while we started looking at, hey, what happens if we add a little bit of guitar, like 5% here, and then maybe 10% here, right? Little bit by little bit. Now, slowly, slowly, slowly. What we wanted to do, though, was kind of experiment with different guitar tones. We didn't just want to take sort of general metal sounds and put those into the game because it didn't feel appropriate. It kind of felt like that. So we started experimenting with different ways to get guitar tones. I was again inspired by the work with that Chris Renner and things had done in the 90s and stuff like that, and specifically Marilyn Manson and an engineer that Marilyn Manson worked with named Sean Bevan. And he had this brilliant technique back in the day of getting this really chunky guitar tone. And it was a guitar tone that they used for like Beautiful People and stuff like that. And one of the methods they used to get that guitar tone was to take the guitar part as it normally was, play it up an octave, and then twice as fast. And you'd record that to tape at 30 inches per second, right? Then you'd take that tape and slow it down to 15 inches per second and get some really interesting results. Now, I had a tape machine and I wanted to give this a try. So this is the guitar part played up an octave, twice as fast. Now, I know it sounds like Bill and Ted at the moment, don't worry. We record that to tape at 30 inches per second, play it back at 15 inches per second, run it through a preamp, which is kind of jacked pretty hard, you get this. Pretty cool stuff, super, super gnarly, right? Another thing I did was started extending the range of the guitar down a lot. Now, I know a lot of people have made jokes about this sort of thing, and fair enough too. I got a hold of a 9-string, right? 9 strings are really freaking crazy. You don't need a 9-string. It's like excessiveness. A 9-string is so low, it is literally like having a 5-string bass on the bottom of your regular guitar. It's kind of stupid. I had this 9-string riff for the main menu theme. The trouble was that it was sounding too much like a guitar. It was sounding, again, too much like a sort of metal thing. And as I said, the whole 9-string thing, yeah, really, really, really stupid. I actually got rid of the 9-string after finishing up the Doom project. I gave it to a buddy of mine. He plays in like the biggest and most aggressive metal band in the world, and even he can't find a use for it. Around the time I was experimenting with this, the Zynaptic plugin people re-released a plugin called Morph. And it's a really cool plugin. I recommend anybody check it out. Basically, what you can do is take 2 sounds and interpolate some characteristics of one sound into another. I don't know exactly how it works, but basically you can take one sound and kind of start to morph it into the other sound. I took a sample of the chainsaw from the original Doom game and started to interpolate that guitar tone with that chainsaw sound. And this is what we ended up with. Doom's kind of violent if I didn't make that point. Sorry, I should have pointed that out at the beginning. Anyway, so this was a really interesting way to kind of start getting some unique guitar tones into the game. Now, once I got this, I felt this was like the little Trojan horse that I was able to sneak into the id Software bases, right? And once I was in there, I was able to put as much guitar in as I wanted. Interestingly, what that allowed us to do was do something that I really love doing on every single project. And that is to create a couple of songs that belong in the game, that kind of become easily identifiable to that game. It's a process I really enjoy doing. It's not just like the score stuff that sits in the background, but it's these songs that fans seem to really enjoy. It's the ones that they point out with. It's the songs that become associated with the game in the end. So once we started doing this guitar thing, it allowed us to do this. It allowed us to get these songs in there. It was finally starting to feel like a Doom game, and not so much just like some nerdy, geeky synth fest. So all of a sudden, just by adding that stuff in there, it started to feel like a Doom game. It started to make the player run around the arena a little bit more and feel comfortable doing that. Also, what was really funny about that is that once the game came out, fans of the game started to make jokes about the song. So there we go. By changing our process, we changed the outcome. We were able to come up with some sounds that fit the game. I would argue that it's not stuff that nobody's ever heard before, but it was something that started to become quite unique for Doom. It fit the project. By adding a bit of guitar and stuff in there, it started to fit the project even further. Even that was in the brief as a no-no, we decided to go back and change that brief in order to better kind of access that other point that was in the brief, which was that it needs to be instantly loved by all the Doom fans out in the world, right? So here's where we are. This is how we started interpreting that brief. Now on Doom, it's impossible to ignore the controversy that the original Doom caused when it first came out back in the 90s. But music has had its fair share of controversy as well.
In May of 1982, teenagers of a congregation in Topeka, Kansas, destroyed thousands of dollars worth of records and tapes, which they felt contained the message of Satan.
I think that within the rock music field, you've got people who really are into the occult and into Satan. They're propagating Satan. They're propagating the demonic line, the occultic world, and I think it's a devastating thing on our culture.
The only thing that's a devastating thing on our culture is that guy's pants. So cool, right? No worries, whatever. One day, I was working on this bass part. 3 notes, repeats. Pretty basic stuff, kind of bored with it. I was looking for something that needed to make this thing interesting.
Is Satan rampant in rock? To some, the answer is obvious. Skull-headed monsters and demon-like figures are probably the most blatant. And there is the number 666, also known as the mark of the beast, the symbol belonging to the Antichrist, who, the Bible tells us, is Satan.
I'm a moth, and that's a really big fucking flame. I was playing around with one of my favorite synths called Harmor. It's made by ImageLine. And one of my favorite little things with Harmor is that you can take an image, any image, load it into the synthesizer, and it starts to generate characteristics of that image across the frequency spectrum. So essentially what you're able to do is insert an image into a wave file, but you need a spectrograph to be able to see it, right? So I found this picture of the number 6, and I put it over the bass part. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a big problem with that there, is that we've got this big giant gap in the middle. So I grabbed Harmor again, and I made another interesting bass using this really interesting image I found on the internet of a star, but it was kind of upside down. Now, at this point, I'm giggling like a child. So much so that Jess, my wife, actually heard the giggling. She came in and she said, "What on earth are you doing?" And she snapped at me at this moment where I had this really childish kind of look on my face. Now, of course, it's a bit of fun, right? You've got to have fun on these projects. But don't worry, I did the thing that any responsible composer would do. I saved it. I put it into Wise. I put it into the game, and I sent it off. And I didn't tell anybody about it. What's the worst that can happen, right? I mean, for anybody to see that, they'd have to crack open the game, pull out the WISE files, and run every single file through a spectrograph and find that single bass part. It's never going to happen, right?
So it doesn't get any clearer than that with all the pentagrams and the 666 right there. They're letting you know, here's our allegiance to Satan, and your children are listening to this.
But wait, there's more. I was working on this drone sound. Pretty horrible, pretty nasty drone sound. Now, if anybody's curious, the way I made this drone sound was by bowed guitar. Everything you're hearing there is bowed guitar. I'm bowing a guitar between C sharp and D, and I've spread that out across 4 octaves. And all I'm doing is just slowly bowing between those 2 notes. And I recorded that a whole bunch of different times and layered it on top of each other. And when you do that, that's the kind of sound you get. It's really, really quite a cool thing. Again, it's kind of using guitars in an interesting way to get that horror thing across. Now, I had this idea one day that I wonder if I can hide a message in there somehow. What happens if I put something in the center and then took a little bit of information from one side of the channel and put that into the other side of the channel and then flip the phase? And what happens is if somebody listens back to that in mono, they get this. So literally there, that's exactly the same sound I just played before, but played back in mono. And what's that all about?
Government investigation has found subliminal messages on certain albums when played in reverse.
Ah, so what happens if we play that in reverse? Now, do you know how many news websites wrote about that one? Friggin' none! So, what did we learn on Zoom? Well, if you want to get a different outcome, you must change the process. Change the process, change the outcome. If you're struggling to come up with something new, if you find yourself stuck in a rut, if you're suffering from creative blocks, change the process. Change the way you're doing things and you'll end up with a different result. Not only that, but have the courage to do so. I say courage, not confidence. Confidence comes from doing the same thing over and over and over and over again. It takes courage to change that. The second thing we learned, change the brief if it makes the project better. Even though the brief said no guitars and we went down that route to begin with, we felt comfortable changing that later on to satisfy a more important element of that brief. Sometimes you cannot do everything. That being said, though, I feel we reached a more interesting place by ignoring the guitar element that was so synonymous with the Doom universe to begin with. I feel if we started with guitars in mind, we would have ended up with something that sounded like those memes I was playing before. And finally, and the most important, a team that encourages an environment where you feel comfortable in failure will enable you to thrive. As a composer on the project, your fear of rejection will often get in the way of you experimenting and pushing the boundaries a little bit more. And that's understandable. Sometimes you're working with somebody who is not encouraging that. I always say whenever you're on a project, you're playing one part as the provider of the music and one part as the educator of music. Try and educate your other team members above, below, and on the same level that an environment in which you're encouraged to fail and feel fine failing is something that will allow you to thrive. Thank you, everybody. So ladies and gentlemen, we've got about 10 to 15 minutes for a bunch of questions. I really encourage anybody who wants to ask a question, just jump straight up to that microphone there and let's get into it. Yo.
Hello.
Hey, man.
This is brilliant, by the way. Thank you. One of my favorite things about your music, both in Doom and in Killer Instinct, is how it's integrated to kind of respond to player actions and player input. Like in Doom, the glory kills cause some of your music to muffle and distort. And then in Killer Instinct, you've got those ultra combos that completely changes the music in real time. And I'm curious, do you have a hand in some of that integration? And can you talk a little bit about the differences between this project and Killer Instinct?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Really, really good question. The reason I chose not to kind of go too much into the implementation side of things on Doom is that there's a lot of questions and things here that usually happens at GDC about this, which allows me to answer those sort of things. But not only that, there's a lot of talks that kind of go into the implementation side of it as well. And I found that there were some really important lessons that I learned on the Doom score, such as the team that really encourages an environment where you feel comfortable in failing, that were kind of really important that you don't really see discussed in a GDC. So thanks so much for answering this question. Essentially, the biggest difference between Killer Instinct and Doom is obviously the style of the game. Killer Instinct has a very predictable structure where you're going to have a first round, a second round, there's the kills at the end, there's combos that can happen. There's this kind of framework that you're working within. Doom, essentially, pretty much every battle in Doom is a linear path, right? You enter the arena, the demons come out, your role is to kill all the demons, and then you kind of move forward. It's this very kind of linear progression. Now, we chose not to do too much crazy dynamic music stuff within that structure because it just seemed to get into the way of the groove. Basically, when that player started and those demons came in, we just wanted it to be on, just going, just bang, 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 bang. Just like you've jumped in the car and you've hit play on that album, right? You're just going, you're off. So that was the biggest thing. There was a couple of little things that we did. Obviously, when you do the glory kills, the music drops out and there's a little riser that happens. We didn't really know how long each glory kill was going to take, so I made a series of what I call endless risers. These are essentially looping risers. Now, I know that's a break in terminology, but let me explain it. Basically, we're taking a shepherd's tone. You ever know what a shepherd tone is? Yeah? Okay, basically it's just taking a series of notes that go from low to high, right? When those notes are coming in high, you're kind of fading in the lower notes again. It's a little bit more complicated than that. I really encourage you to jump on Google and check it out. It's a really interesting thing. But if you use this philosophy, you can create these looping rises. It just feels constantly like there's this tension rising. It's really, really handy in game environments when you're stuck in a situation where you don't know how long something is going to go for. So we did that. And then other times we started to experiment with this idea of like the music had started and like there was the hi-hat and the basic riff kicking along, and then bam, when everything kicked in, that's when the music would start, and that's when it really kicked in. Honestly, that's as complicated as the dynamic music system in Doom was. How I delivered that stuff to the team, I would always break my songs out and put that stuff into Wise, and then I'd send the Wise files off to the team. The stuff I'd break out was mainly just for variation. So we didn't have like a single 3-minute loop. I would break that down into into a series of different bars, so it would be constantly rearranging. But it's not rearranging on any data or anything like that. It's just going from there. That's very different to another project that I'm on at the moment, where we're exploring all sorts of really interesting stuff that you can do with dynamic music. So yeah, there's all sorts of different ways you can take it. Thanks for the question.
That's really exciting. Thank you.
Cool, thank you.
Hi,
Hey, man.
thank you for a super nerdy talk. Actually, I have 3 very quick,
Shoot, no worries.
very nerdy questions. So first of all, the setup that you made,
Yes.
You use sine waves, right?
Yes.
Did you experiment with saw waves, square waves, just to get more harmonics?
Yeah, interesting. So the first thing there, basically everything started as a sine wave. What I wanted to do, as I said before, is to try and capture whatever the pedal was going to add to it. Now, if one of those pedals has a preamp stage that's ramping that sine wave up into clipping range, and then it runs through a clipper that's clipping off that sine wave, you're instantly creating a square wave there. So some of those things would happen naturally and organically within that system. I didn't experiment with any other waves being sent through it. Everything was sine waves. What I did do a couple of times, though, was send 2 sine waves through the system that were slightly pitched differently. So to create this phase imbalance, and that would do all sorts of crazy stuff to the pedals.
Okay, second, another question. That setup created actually these really punchy high attack sounds, right? Did you put an envelope on it, or was it just the compressor working?
So a lot of the time it was a combination of things. One was the splitter sending to the sidechain compressors. I would send the signal out, and I'd set the attack so it would be, say, 0.3 or 30, whatever it is, 30. So yeah, 30 milliseconds. And that usually creates a really, really nice and sharp attack. And then everything was running through a slow compressor at the end that was really pinning things back right that. Once that came into the computer, I might do some more processing within the computer itself, such as transient processing and things like that, just to kind of get those transients really to punch through. Transients, I believe, are really the key to getting a really punchy sounding game mix. When you've got all these sound effects and screams and gunshots and all this sort of stuff going through, if you've got just a solidly limited thing sitting in the background, it doesn't come through. What you want is those dynamics going, hey, I'm a punch, then I'm gone. Hey, I'm a punch, then I'm gone. And that tricks the player's ear into believing that there's more solid music happening in the background.
Okay, final simple question. Did you only use a DAW, or actually maybe use some hardware sequencers or arpeggiators and these kind of things?
No, I didn't. I had a Eurorack system that I used to generate a whole bunch of different stuff that I used. I didn't really talk about in this talk because that's kind of general sort of stuff. Set up a synth, set up a sequencer, play some stuff. I mean, people have kind of done that stuff a lot. So I did use a little bit of that, but once we created that sort of array, that Doom array system, I found that was enough to get really interesting pure textures that were coming out that really suited the game itself.
Okay, thank you so much for the talk.
Cool, no worries.
I hope you don't mind if I rip off an experiment with your setup.
Yeah, no, please. That's the idea of sharing it, right? That's the whole idea of GDC. Please.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great talk. I'm glad we didn't all kill each other when the music went on. First
still
question,
time.
I'd love to hear your take on your take on sequencing when you release the songs just to be listened to on your stereo. The soundtrack came out. I play it a lot. I almost kill people listening to it. And just what recommendation you have based on your experience with this soundtrack along with others about sequencing, lots of different content from your Rise full-on songs to your sort of dip stuff.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that question as well. Thank you so much. So I believe that a soundtrack is usually a wasted opportunity with a video game. I really get so disappointed when I'm a big fan of the game, and then the soundtrack itself comes out, and the soundtrack is just like a whole bunch of loops that they've pulled out of wires and then thrown on an iTunes playlist or whatever. For me, the soundtrack is the absolute best opportunity to put forth the best representation of that music. So it's something that needs to be treated almost like a separate project. We had a lot of fun on the soundtrack. We had these monologues that I pulled from the game, basically voiceover files that were pulled from the game. And I used those to separate these different segments of the soundtrack, which was basically inspired by sort of 70s and 80s concept albums, like sort of metal albums. I was hugely inspired by the War of the Worlds concept album. And then, yeah, just made some pretty cool arrangements and stuff like that that people would enjoy it too. It's important to understand the context. A soundtrack needs to be enjoyed on its own. You need to be able to put that soundtrack in the car and use it as a memento from your time playing with the game. It's a lot more than just a collection of loops that you pulled out of the game just to make some sort of marketing opportunity. Cool.
And a quick follow-up, do you have hints about the remaining Easter eggs? I think you said there are 5?
Yeah, so there's 5 Easter eggs. I think 4 have been found. There's one that hasn't been found yet. Yeah, I don't know. Keep looking. Thanks, man. Yo.
Hi, Mick. Arnie.
Hey, Arnie.
I wanted to know, since you finished this project, if you've had to spend some time, like, in the church to purify your wicked soul.
Oh, look, I mean, I didn't put that stuff in there to offend anybody. I mean, it probably did, right? I mean, of course, if anybody's going to do that. Obviously, people got pretty upset about that sort of stuff. It's silly for me to say that's not the intention. I mean, I can say it's not the intention, but once it leaves me in my own mind, I have no control over it. It's out there, okay? Now, I understood that when we were playing in that realm, it's going to happen. I felt we were able to do it in Doom because Doom itself is full of demons, full of pentagrams, full of religious stuff. The story behind Doom is that this evil corporation has the people that work for the corporation under such a tight roll with a thumb that they're able to get away with all sorts of things. The corporation itself, once you get higher up in the corporation levels, you can opt in to become a human sacrifice and things like this. So, I mean, there's all sorts of that stuff that's in the game already.
Thanks, man. Amazing score.
Yeah, cheers. Good question. Yo.
Hi there. So I'm a graphics programmer, so please correct me if I'm full of shit.
No.
But I noticed a bunch of Doom themes coming out in the music, and I was kind of surprised you didn't mention that in your talk. So what was your process there in like integrating those themes and choosing what themes to put in?
Yeah,
and how did you put them in?
Yeah, no, good question.
Thanks.
Again, I always feel it's a wasted opportunity when you're working on a pre-existing franchise that you don't pay some tribute to what's happened in the past. I feel that's really, really super important. I didn't talk about it so much in this talk. I've talked about that in a couple of other talks, and I wanted to focus more on those sort of geeky details that I can't talk about at, say, some other conference, right? But yeah, to me, it's really super important to do that. Those themes, whether we like it or not, work their way into the consciousness of the fan base. The fans are expecting to hear that. It to them is as much of an icon within that game universe as the name Doom itself. That's very, very important. How I chose which ones to use, basically I'd just be working on a track and see whichever sort of theme I could fit in there. Sometimes I work them in a really obvious way. The theme for the baddie in the game, hers is based on one of the Bobby Prince's original themes very, very clearly. But some other times there'd just be like a riff that would come in for 2 or 3 seconds and then it would go back out. And it's just so the player playing can go, oh yeah, cool, it's a Doom game. And then they go back into killing demons and stuff like that. So yeah, that's it. Good question though.
Awesome.
Cheers.
Thanks for the talk.
Yeah, no worries. I probably got time for one more, so this is really cool. Yeah.
There's only one more.
Yeah, no worries.
Could you briefly touch on how the music works with the sound design in general? Because I feel like sound design is a major like storytelling tool.
Yeah, cool. No, of course. So I don't feel 100% confident talking about this because I wasn't in control, in charge of this sort of thing. That responsibility obviously falls onto the sound team and the audio director. But I can talk about kind of the stuff that we made sure that we did together. For a tight mix, for me, one of the most important things is tonal elements, right? So if there's a tonal element that's happening in the game, it's very important that that is in a similar key or same root note or whatever it might be of the music that's playing. So you'll notice in a couple of levels there you pick up a chain gun, right? And this chain gun is able to be split out into 3 chain guns. So you've got like this ultimate killer chain gun thing going on, right?
Yeah, the turret.
And the sound of this chain gun, the bullets firing out of it happening so quickly that it produces a tone. That was the philosophy behind that. Now, we made sure that the tone of that was a D note. It was a low D note. And that D note was sitting with the same music that was sitting in the background, which is also sitting on a D. So when you do that, you get this really solid mix that's happening. You don't have frequencies that are clashing. My best thing that I can say about that really is that it's something that really needs to be considered on every project. It's not an afterthought, and it's not something that you can fix in Wise or whatever you're using later on. If you're ducking stuff when something else happens, or if you're trying to compress this when this is happening, you're fixing a problem that shouldn't be there in the first place. Now, those tools exist to allow us to fix that, but ultimately, if you can carve your sounds and your music with that stuff in mind to begin with, you're going to end up with a much tighter mix in the end.
Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a really good GDC.